with our evening services that we've had over the years. Last couple I've tried to do something a little bit different from just sort of a regular preaching or teaching time. And I picked the book of Esther, I think it was post-COVID actually, post-COVID as we came out, because it was such a wonderful book about God's providence, God protecting his people in a hostile culture when often they felt fairly helpless, fairly overwhelmed, and the way that God works in our life and in our circumstances. And last time we had, got together, the question was, is God still at work in 2021? And of course you can ask the same question tonight, this year. And this quote is from Dr. Robert Bell, who wrote a book on Old Testament messages. And in his chapter on Esther, he says, look, even without the spectacular, the Lord is very much at work in our everyday circumstances. Therefore, we need not be frustrated about events that we cannot control. National, international incidents, and this was like before Russia invades Ukraine, right? That was, biggest concern a year or two ago was like COVID and work and shutting things down and all these sort of things, all right? National, international incidents, whether they be tragedies, economic fluctuations, are all under his providential control. We must recognise that God has the power and the will to bring about reversals. And this is what the book of Esther is full of. Reversing circumstances. And the one who is in danger is delivered. The one who is in power loses their power, their control. It's about reversals. In Christ we experience the great reversal, from death to life, from condemnation to glory. And this is, I guess, where so much of the Old Testament points us ultimately to the work of Jesus Christ on our behalf. What happens in this book, in a nutshell, we learn about a Jewish girl who becomes a queen. Okay, how many little girls want to grow up, be a princess or a queen? Well, this little girl did. She did. She saves her people from a plot to destroy them with the help of her cousin. And we learn about a new feast, Purim, that was established to remember God's great deliverance of his people. So Esther is one of many episodes in not only the Old Testament, but certainly world history, modern history of God protecting his people. How does this book impact us today? We might think that this has nothing at all to do with us. Well, had the plan to destroy God's people come to pass, no Jewish nation, no Jesus, and no salvation. There was much at stake. There was much at stake in the trials of God's people then, and certainly afterwards. And you've probably, obviously focused on this before. But what is unusual about this particular book of all the books in the Bible is, firstly, of course, along with Ruth, only two books, smaller books named after a woman in the Bible. And it's the only book in the Bible where God is not mentioned by name. But don't let that deceive you. Okay? God can be present without being mentioned. You realise that? God can be present and still not get a mention. Okay? Even today, when God's name is not mentioned in many, many places, you think he's not there? You think he's not there? You think he doesn't know? No, we can't keep God out of our lives. The wicked can't keep God out of this world. It's just impossible. But it is a book where, deliberately, on purpose, the writer omits God's name. Even when there's references to fastings, prayer is not mentioned, even though in the Bible fasting and prayer go hand in hand. Why? Because it's a deliberate omission. To focus on God's work behind the scenes. There are other chapters in the Bible like Jesus, he does great miracles and, God is at work. God's at work. But in books like Esther, elsewhere, You have God very much seemingly behind the scenes, still accomplishing his purpose. Now, in terms of where Esther is in the Bible, okay, these events occur about 500 years before birth of Jesus, land of Persia, now Iran. It's the last of the 12 books of history, Joshua being the first, Esther being the last. And so, unless you've got a chronological Bible, like a few of us here, Esther appears, in chronology towards the early part of the Old Testament in terms of book order, but not history. Not history. It is one of the last books that we have in the Old Testament time about God's people in a strange land. Many Jews returned to Jerusalem after the decree of Cyrus in 538 BC. They could go back to Jerusalem, but some voluntarily remained. They remained. Just like Jews today, not every Jew is in Israel. And one reason is that it's not always the best life in Israel. If you're living fairly well in America or Europe or elsewhere, you may not want to start again in the Promised Land. And so not every Jew wants to go back to the Promised Land. Not every Jew wants to. So some voluntarily remained in the dispersed lands, including Persia, and they worshipped in synagogues. They got together in synagogues, as we learnt this morning about giving. You needed 10 families. You could have yourself a synagogue, a local assembly, worship, gathering, things like that. Esther is the only record in the Bible, biblical record, of the majority of Jews who remained in Persia rather than return to Judea. Now, what was life in ancient Persia like? Well, I suppose it was a bit like life in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Sophisticated, decadent, fairly dangerous. You could be up the pole of power and influence one day, and then the next you fall out with the king, and your life is over. Interestingly, the Persians were monotheists. They didn't have many gods. They said there was only one God, but many emanations of the one God. Still defective worship. Still not worshipping Jehovah, of course, but certainly a bit more developed than some of the other cultures where they're worshipping anything and everything. But they still said that God had different emanations, and some of that sort of thinking comes into liberal Christianity today about Jesus becoming God, Spirit becoming God, these kinds of things, people becoming God, right? That kind of stuff. All right. Now, a simple outline from Wilmington's Guide to the Bible. You can't beat a 3-point outline for a book. Rise of Esther, the lies of Haman, and then the prize of faith. It's about as simple a review or an outline as you can do from Esther. And as I said, I just want to very, very quickly, chapter 1, Queen Vashti refuses to appear at the king's feast. He's not expecting that. He is not expecting that. The king takes up a suggestion, and the king is a person in this book that is he can be manipulated pretty easily. People say things in his ear and he says, what a great idea. That's how he's leading. Oh, what a great idea from someone else. So they have a beauty contest. Didn't have to do that. They could have just picked another girl. Didn't have to have a contest, but let's try and repair the king's reputation. Let's try and really, give it to Vashti. Let's have a kingdom-wide search for a beautiful, beautiful woman. All right. Chapter 2, the orphan Jewish girl Esther is chosen as the new queen. Her relative Mordecai exposes a plot to kill the king. He brings the plot to the authorities, and the conspirators are hanged, but there's no reward for Mordecai, no reward for her. 3 and 4, Haman gets permission from the king to destroy Mordecai and all Jews just because Mordecai won't bow to him. I mean, what an insane overreaction. Someone won't show you a little bit of respect, and so let's wipe everyone out. There's a real satanic element to this request. A great satanic element. And then in chapter 4, Mordecai appeals to Esther to intervene on behalf of her people. She hasn't yet told anyone that she is a Jew. She's not to do that. And we'll see there was great wisdom in her not giving all the information about her past to the king. But Mordecai knows that she's been put there for such a time as this. She's in a strategic place to influence her husband, the king. Then 5 and 6, Esther holds a banquet. She's now the queen. She holds a banquet. And she invites Haman. And Haman thinks he is set. Haman thinks he is flavour of the month in the kingdom. He thinks that to Haman, his star keeps shining, His star keeps shining for Haman. And to celebrate, he makes gallows to hang, hopefully, Mordecai. To hang now, I don't want to give our kids any nightmares tonight, but it wasn't they didn't just hang people in Persia. They just put a rope around their neck, it seems. It was pretty gruesome. It was an impaling that everybody got to see. An impaling that everyone got to see. It was a pretty nasty way to deal with enemies of the state and criminals, all right? But the word that's used in the English Bible is gallows. It's the closest thing that we've got to sort of describe what they're doing. So he has these great gallows made. In chapter 6, Mordecai is finally honoured because he doesn't get rewarded those years ago for exposing the plot. But what's really fascinating is that he's rewarded because, remember, the king can't sleep. King can't sleep. And he's so bored that he wants to read history. Right? He wants to read some history of his kingdom. And so they read to him about this plot and this man Mordecai, and somehow he wasn't rewarded. This is a big oversight. You want to reward people that keep you alive, yeah? You want to, give them a nice big house and, wife or two and, whatever kings do to reward people for saving their life. But Mordecai is overlooked. It seems like there's a reason for that too. When we're overlooked, friends, God has a reason. God has a reason. When you don't get picked for this or that, when you don't get the promotion or the this or that, you get overlooked. There's a reason for that in God's plan. There's a reason for that. One reason is we can learn something from it. We can learn that, maybe someone was better than me. Maybe I got a bit to learn, maybe I need to get a bit better before I get what I really want, yeah? But he gets rewarded. He's honoured. And the king has this idea, Haman, how would you honour a man? How would you honour a man? And Haman thinks it's him. No, it's about Mordecai. And then Haman has the ignominious task of leading Mordecai on horseback for a parade. And Haman has to lead him along. But guess what? Haman realises that he is now condemned. He realises that Mordecai, who he wanted to destroy with the Jewish people, now this Mordecai is getting honoured. His plan, his plot is getting untangled. It's getting untangled. Some sobering truths. G. Campbell Morgan said that even the seat of global power, where the ways and heart of God are not even considered, God is present. God is present. God uses seemingly unrelated events, personal tensions, ambitions to ultimately bring to pass his plans. He can do that. And when Morgan summarised the book of Esther, he said it is God amid the shadows, a fragment of profane history captured for sacred purposes. I mean, a lot of that happens in Esther is fairly unsavoury. You know, it's fairly gaudy, you know. It's like, yeah, this is what happens in pagan countries. This is what they get up to. Well, God can even use those things to accomplish his will. The overruling of God on behalf of his people in a foreign land. You know, like think about what happens with Daniel. You know, God's power works outside the promised land. God doesn't have to be in Israel to be powerful. He can be powerful in Egypt, in Babylon, and in Persia. He can be powerful everywhere. Think about the unlikely means in Esther. The queen refuses to appear at a feast. No one dreams she's going to do that, because she's putting her life at risk by refusing to come out for the king. No one dreams of that. The calling of a pageant for a new queen. Who would have thought of that? Why can't he just pick another girl? I mean, takes a moment. Pick someone else. Mordecai goes unrewarded. How does that happen? How can they not reward a person that saves the king's life? Mordecai refuses to honour Haman. Why not just bow to him like he's just an earthly guy and, you know, nod the head? Why make such an issue of it? Mordecai. The king receives Esther, agrees to hold a feast. Haman gets invited. Who would have thought? What's Esther up to? What's she doing? Chapter 5, Haman builds gallows for Mordecai. 6, the king can't sleep, so he reads about Mordecai's foiling the plot to kill him. All of these unlikely means, all of these loose ends, God is going to do something with. He's going to work and act. So into Esther 7. Esther 7. The king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. The second day, the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." Remember Herod promising similarly to Herodias. It's a figure of speech. It's like, I'm going to be generous with you. I'm going to be generous. I'm the king. I can give you whatever I want. What do you want? Esther's been working, probably praying toward this, to come and bring her request before the king. Well, she answers, "If I found favour in your sight, O king, and if it please the king," look what she says, "let my life be given me and my petition and my people at my request." She is identifying for the first time with the Jews. She's identifying with them. She says, "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated," just like the earlier decree. She said, "Look, had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue. If it was just a matter of us being slaves again, like in Egypt, yeah, they're slaves. But we're under a death sentence. We're under a death sentence." And so she brings her request to the king. And, you know, though they are married, this is not a modern marriage, friends. It's not a modern marriage, right? This is very, very ancient. Where he's the king, he holds your life in his power as well. You're one of many wives. And you approach him very reverently, very cautiously. And she says, "I'm in danger, my people are in danger." And the king has no idea about this. He has no idea about this. So the king answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he?" Now, in a sense, the king is complicit. He's the one that gave the order. He gave the order. Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, "The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman." Adversary, enemy, these are words for Satan in the scriptures. These are words for Satan. It's Haman. I mean, this is like a knife through Haman's heart. A knife through his heart. It says here that Haman was terrified. Terrified. It's hard to get across that feeling of abject fear of my life. My life is coming to an end before my eyes, right? I mean, he's thinking my life is going, it's gone. He's terrified before the king and also the queen. Haman's fortunes are changing in moments. In moments. One of the most powerful men in Persia His life is very, very doubtful now. Very doubtful. The king arose in his wrath. The king, he's furious. With Haman, yes, certainly. But the king must have connected Haman's request and the king's order to destroy the Jews. The king's angry because you can't reverse a royal decree. It's the law of the Medes and Persians, right? Well, the king, he went into the palace garden. It's like dad goes off to the shed, he's upset and he has a quiet hour or two, right? So he goes, he's off. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life. He can't really go to the king again. King's angry with him. But Esther can talk to the king for me. She can talk to the king. He pleads for her, for his life, when he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. If he follows the king, he's just going to aggravate things, and he probably, as a servant, shouldn't have followed him anyway. Now look at verse 8. When the king returned from the palace garden, Haman had fallen. He fell. He tripped. Across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" Right. This looks like Haman trying to take advantage of the queen's wife while he's out there in the garden. I mean, could you imagine in Nazi Germany getting a little too close to Hitler's girl? You imagine what's going to happen to you, right? He falls. He slips. He's there near the couch, near her. But you walk in and this looks like a really compromising situation. And look at how the verse ends. As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. He didn't need to say anything more, right? As soon as he says that, and hey, the king now can have his life taken for that offence. Getting too close to my wife, let alone the other plans that he hatched. All right? It's chilling, isn't it? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Did his servants just sort of have these handy? These cloths they put over people's faces. Oh, we'll just, he's gone. See you later. But he is a dead man walking. He's a dead man walking. All right? Now, Harbonah, this is one of the eunuchs, one of the king's servants, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high. That's about 7 to 8 stories high." Now I've never done executions personally. I've been tempted at times in the ministry, but you don't need gallows 7 or 8 stories high to harm someone. 12 feet will do. 12 feet will do. I mean, you want to show off, right? If you want to hang someone from 7, 8 stories high, you want everyone to see who this enemy is. Yeah. Which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf. He is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, "Hang him on it. Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. He deals with Haman in one foul swoop. Now, the story here is fairly straightforward. But again, what is actually happening here? What is going on in Esther 7? Well, you have a lot of reversals going on. You have reversals. You have what we call changes of fortune. You have much reaping for what was previously sown. Haman is reaping what he sowed. Haman is getting what he plainly deserved. As shocking as being impaled and hung is, Haman was getting what he deserved. God avenges his enemies. God vindicates his people. One writer, and it's interesting, some of the better commentaries are written by some sisters in the Lord. Karen Jobes from the NIV Application Commentary. She says, harem protocol dictated that no one but the king could be left alone with a woman of the harem. So Haman should not have gone and approached Esther the way he did. Haman should have left Esther's presence when the king retreated to the garden, but where could he have gone? Where does he go? His choice was either to follow the king, who had bolted in anger from his presence, or flee the room, suggesting guilt. If he runs away, he's guilty. He's trapped. Even in the presence of others, a man was not to approach a woman of the king's harem within 7 steps. That was the rule. You didn't get too close to any of them. That Haman should actually fall on the couch where Esther is reclining is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. His untoward behaviour is so unimaginable that in the Aramaic Targum, this is a Jewish commentary. He falls on the queen's couch only because the angel Gabriel gives him a firm shove. There was an angel there. There was an angel just, pushed him. Explains things. I mean, that, it probably, you think, it's that or he just tripped, right? He just tripped. Well, that's how they looked at this scenario. By designing the death of Haman the Agagite, Queen Esther succeeded where her ancestor King Saul had failed. He failed. She didn't. She didn't fail. Think about the verses that get brought to life in Esther 7. Don't avenge yourselves, God's word says. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Right? Esther just waits for the right time. She lets things run their course. She appeals to the king, puts her trust in the Lord. Think about Galatians 6. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. To the spirit or to the flesh. Mordecai gets what he deserves. Think about Genesis 12. I'll bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. Well, that happens in the book of Esther. Proverbs 4:19, the way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. Literally. Literally. We're not even in control of our steps, friends. I mean, you can be perfectly sober and trip over. And yet that trip, with the help of Gabriel or not, sealed Haman's fate. Sealed his fate. 2 quotes, one of Josephus. He says, I can't forbear to admire God and to learn his wisdom and justice, not only in punishing the wickedness of Haman, but in so disposing it that he should undergo the very same punishment that he contrived for another. What he thought was going to happen to Mordecai happens to himself. And says, and thereby he teaches others this lesson, that what mischiefs anyone prepares against another, he, without knowing of it, first contrives it against himself. Okay? So, it applies to God's people when we act in the flesh and retaliate, react. Friends, it's a boomerang. We've just thrown a boomerang. It's coming back. It's coming back on our heads. Got to realise that. And I appreciate what Job says here. His example shows that human evil is self-deceptive. It allows evildoers to believe themselves justified in their evil actions and clever enough not to get caught. Not to get caught. Haman had all the resources of the empire on his side as he schemed and plotted: power, prestige, wealth. But it all came to nothing because of that one unforeseen, unpredictable night of the king's insomnia. He couldn't control how the king slept. Couldn't control that. And that was just enough. Just enough to set a bowling ball down the aisle and all the pins starting to fall down, right? She says, we've all read well-written mysteries of the perfect murder, Agatha Christie and others. that's finally solved by some chance event the murderer could never have foreseen or prevented. Someone just sort of sees him or her. People sin with the delusion that while others may get caught, they will not. They will not. Right? Self-deception. And Haman cannot fool the Lord. Just two more slides left. Haman does get what he deserves. Deborah Reed, in her commentary on Esther, this is worth considering. The end comes for Haman as a result of the circumstances and coincidences conspiring against him in a farcical manner. This is black comedy, friends. The final blow to Haman's life comes by way of a false accusation. No, he hadn't intended to harm Esther. But then Mordecai and the Jews hadn't intended to harm the king in Persia either. But they were condemned. Not dissimilar to the injustice of a false accusation that the Jewish people themselves had suffered at Haman's hands, you see. Maybe it was a false accusation, but the result, very, very fair indeed. But then she says the Christ of the story has not yet been resolved. So there's still some things to finish in Esther we don't get to tonight. There's still an edict out there that needs to be made null and void. There's still an order. A day is going to come when they can attack the Jews with impunity. But notice this, the last Persian banquet has taken place with Esther as host. The remaining banquets will celebrate Jewish honour and success. The resolution of the story is in view. So we're getting to the final deliverance. But now that Haman has been killed, most of the problem's gone. Most of the problem is gone. We now just have to deal with the king's order that's still in place. Finally, as we'll finish up, the gospel in Esther. Think about Esther finally identifying with her people in their condemnation. She says, King, I and my people, we are condemned. We're condemned. And then she goes to work on their behalf. She pleads for them. And she will bring them out of condemnation. She will bring them out of condemnation and judgment, as it were, to a resurrection and peace and prosperity and a continuation of God's promise to Abraham. And so we might talk about this a little bit more in the next couple of lessons we have. But the gospel is there in the book of Esther. It's there, Esther, there identifying with them in their condemnation. Christ identified with us in our sin. He became sin for us. And he took the curse for us and he rose again so we can identify with him in his life, in his resurrection, in his glorification.